My uncle works for dispatch in my town, and he recently told my family about the weirdest call he's ever received. He said that one night he got a call from a landline, but when he answered, there was only static on the other end. This happened 2 more times. Finally, he dispatched a squad to check out the address from the caller ID. When the cops arrived and walked into the house, they immediately saw a dead body. The person had been dead for 5 months. The craziest part was that there was no electricity or any other utility working, so there was no way those calls should have been able to reach dispatch. But if they hadn't, who knows how long that person's body would have stayed there. Not my call, but my dad served for 25 years. It wasn't really a ghost story, but I think it's worth telling. One night, he got a call from a woman who said her neighbor had made a pact with the devil. The caller was about 35 and quite religious, while the neighbor in question was around 75 at the time. My dad went over and knocked on the door, and the old lady answered, all happy. Her place was nicely decorated, the same way it had been for the past 50 years. She invited my dad in without even asking why he came, made him some coffee, and asked how his day was. Naturally, at this point, my dad was wondering what the heck the call was about. But it soon became clear. At some point, my dad realized he wasn't the only person she was talking to. She thought her apartment was full of people. My dad thanked her for the coffee, and she told him to come back anytime. While she was talking, he wrote down the names of the people she mentioned and did some research when he got back. It turned out she was talking to family members who were all dead. She had a daughter, 3 sons, a brother, and a husband, all deceased. She had no family or friends and hadn't spoken to another person in years. Her groceries were delivered, and she rarely left her apartment. Over the next 19 years, my dad took care of her. My sister and I often came over and just sat and talked with her. She even taught me how to cook. Over the years, she stabilized and stopped talking to her dead relatives. She just needed people to live with. She actually lived until she was 94 and died in the guest room of my parents' house, as it had become harder to take care of her from a distance as she neared the end. She was like a grandmother to us. My uncle was the sheriff of a small town in New Mexico. He was the most hardcore person in our family. Super straight-laced, never really BS'd, and wasn't at all a joker. So when he told this story, backed up by my aunt, we all believed it without question. A local reporter named Bob D. would always show up at any major police activity from the police scanner. Big car wrecks, fires, anything worth reporting in the local paper. Everybody on the force knew Bob D. He was around at least once or twice a week at various police activities. Bob was a bit of a joker himself. He would mess with people by flicking behind their ears. People would react to the flicks, thinking it was a bug, only to turn around and see it was Bob joking around. Everybody liked Bob. Unfortunately, Bob had bad lung cancer and died pretty suddenly. His wife buried him against his wishes. He wanted to be cremated. For the next couple of weeks after his funeral, people kept talking about seeing Bob at car wrecks, fires, all the same stuff he used to report on. There were 20 to 30 reports like this from civilians and members of the force. My uncle didn't buy it, until the night he and my aunt showed up at our house, gun drawn, pale as paper. We asked him what the hell happened, and he had to sit down, catch his breath, compose himself, and start to outline what happened. Note, this is a guy that I never saw get rattled by anything. He said he and my aunt were sitting on the couch in their house watching TV. My uncle kept scratching at his ear, over and over. Finally, my aunt asked him what the problem was, and he turned around just in time to see their bedroom door open. Bob D. was standing there in the doorway, clear as day. My uncle jumped up, cussed or something, got my aunt's attention, who turned to see him there too. As soon as they both made eye contact with him, Bob smiled, turned, walked across the living room, and out their front door. He closed the door behind himself and was gone. My uncle got control of himself and ran outside, gun drawn, looking for Bob, but he was gone. At that point, they ran over to our place. We went over there and didn't see anything, but my aunt and uncle stayed at our place that night. At work the next day, all the guys on the force were giving my uncle lots of "we told you so." People around town said they saw Bob D. show up at police scenes for at least another 2 to 3 months. My dad saw him in our darkroom in our basement with a friend. He was flicking their ears in the dark. During the 3rd month, people who saw him kept saying he was looking worse and worse. My uncle saw him 2 more times, each time confirming he was looking more and more worn. My dad concluded that he was decomposing and his ghost was reflecting that process. Every time my ear itches, I get goosebumps. Not me, but my dad was a cop for 32 years. This was one of his craziest calls. A call went out for reported screaming. It was mid-January, important later. My father and another officer responded to find a known deranged individual with a very long rap sheet and a history of being in and out of psychiatric care for years, sitting on the front porch holding a double-sided wood-splitting axe. Steam was rising from the grass, and there were chunks lying all over the lawn. Upon interviewing the suspect, he admitted that he and a friend were playing poker. The suspect was losing nearly every hand and concluded that his friend was a haint, Southern slang for ghost, and was cheating him. The suspect grabbed the axe and chased his friend outside, hacking him into dozens of pieces, causing the warm blood to create steam on the grass. My dad told the suspect that he needed to get in the police car because it was haint-proof. The suspect dropped the axe and sprinted to get in the back seat, thanking them for helping him. I worked as a police officer in a small town in rural Nebraska. Back in the 90s, I was patrolling through town in winter. We had several abandoned houses in town, but one seemed to attract copper thieves, so we were told to keep an eye on it. Around 7 p.m., I drove by it. Since it sat on a corner lot, I had a clear view of all 4 sides of the house. As I drove around the corner, nothing looked out of the ordinary. About 2 hours later, I drove by again, and the back door was wide open. I knew the back door was not open when I drove by earlier. Looking at the snow on the ground around the house, there were no footprints. So I thought, what the hell? I called dispatch, told them I was investigating an open door at that address, and asked for a county sheriff to start my way. I walked to the open door, pulled out my flashlight, and shone it inside. The house had obviously been gutted for the most part. The plaster walls were torn down, debris piles were everywhere. Since there were no footprints in the snow around the door other than mine, and with all the dust on the floor not showing any footprints, I chalked it up to the wind, or maybe the door was just opening on its own. I was about to secure the door when I heard a loud thump come from upstairs and what sounded like kids laughing. So I entered the house and yelled out, "Police department, come downstairs." More sounds like kids playing. I told dispatch it sounded like there were kids in the house and started making my way through the kitchen into the living room where the stairs were, all the while cautiously checking the main floor. 2 more times, I heard something upstairs, but since I had no response, I started thinking maybe it was an animal. Still, I heard what I swore were kids laughing. I headed upstairs, and it all got quiet. The upstairs was relatively small, with a hallway at the top of the stairs that had 1 bedroom on the right, 1 straight ahead at the end of the hall, and a bedroom on the left. As I got to the top of the stairs, I heard a thump in the bedroom to the left. I carefully peeked around the door, and it was an empty room with a small pile of plaster and with debris in the middle. No kidding, sitting on top of the pile of debris was a page torn out of a child's book with a picture of a police officer on it. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I got out of that room, quickly cleared the other rooms upstairs, and got the hell out of there. I told dispatch nobody was in the house, locked the back door, and never went back in there again. Called to a residence out in the boonies. This was in Wyoming, so the boonies are really the boonies, at about 11 p.m. about suspicious activity. When we get there, we are told by the family living there that there are very strange screams coming from a creek area about 1,000 feet out. And sure enough, waiting outside on the porch with them for about a minute, I hear it. It is very hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything. It just sounded like a cry of sheer terror. And it repeated again. We tell the family we are going to investigate, so we just walk down to the creek since it was nice out. We hear about 2 more screams, getting louder as we approach the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are two possibilities. Someone is getting murdered/maimed in the creek bed, or it's a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come towards if they are there. Then we hear the exact same scream behind us, exactly from where we came from. We get about halfway back to the house, and the scream comes so loudly it seems to be right next to us. We frantically shine our flashlights everywhere and find nothing. No eye glints of animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back, and the scream comes from around the creek again. This time, it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat becomes a little more hastened. By this time, we were both scared shitless and verified with the family to call us again if they heard it. They never called again, and we got the hell out of there. I still don't know what it was. As an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that can move stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there is always some type of ambient animal sounds. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, owls hooting, coyotes howling, etc. But there was nothing, until we were leaving and the screams had stopped. Then a frog started croaking. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it still. Back when I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working night shift. Didn't deal with 99% of the bullshit that day shift dealt with, and what little stuff we did deal with was usually really interesting. Well, most every building on a base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desk, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base and go check the building, pull on all the doors, see if we can get in. If we can, we go into the building and secure it, check all the doors and corners to see if someone set the alarm off. Well, one night I was on patrol with my alpha partner, and we get called to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem, keep patrolling. So about 15 to 20 minutes go by and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler roomish thing. Nothing in it, we close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes. And another alarm. We respond, all the doors are still locked and we can't get in, maintenance door is locked. Call in the all clear. This time my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming and yanking the doors real hard to set the alarm off. We sit there and watch, nothing happens, and right as we're about to leave, another alarm activation as we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and to let us in. This is like now 3 a.m. Building custodian shows up and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all the maintenance rooms, and that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now this room is literally the size of a closet. We walk down there and look in, no one's in it, and that door is locked when it closes. We look in there and we find a single footprint of a bare foot made of water, left foot as a recall of a small child. Freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left. No one entered, and we checked every inch of that damn place. Literally a 3-hour deep sweep including ceiling tiles. Freaked the ever-loving shit out of us, and to this day, my partner refuses to go into that school. Speaking of which, schools are really fucking spooky when they're empty. Police officer here. One evening about 8 years ago, it was pouring outside and we got a call from an elderly woman. Seems to be a common theme. She called in and said that she was hearing footsteps in her house, and she thought there was a ghost inside because she regularly heard the sound of someone walking upstairs, but she lived alone. We went just to check it out and make sure that everything was okay. She stayed on the line with the 911 operator because she was frightened. About 3 minutes after she initially called in, she said that there was actually a man standing outside in her backyard, staring at her through her sliding glass door. Petrified, the woman froze in that spot and continued to stare directly at the man. For the next minute or two, she said that he was just standing there, still as could be, staring at her. Eventually, the man slunk off out of sight. When we arrived, about 12 minutes after the call first came in, we went to the front door. I remained in the foyer with the woman, and the other officer went to the backyard to see if the man was still hiding out or if there were any traces of him. I spoke with her for several minutes until the other officer returned. He said there was no trace of anyone having been in the backyard. We set off to do a quick sweep before we left to make sure the house was all clear. In her living room, the room that has the sliding glass door, we discovered a trail of mud and footprints inside the house. I asked the woman if she had been outside at all that day or if anyone had been over to visit her. She said no, that she lived alone, and that no one had come by to visit. The woman was very old, probably around 85, and had very poor eyesight and was hard of hearing, as elderly people tend to be. The woman obviously had seen the man's reflection and mistakenly thought he was in front of her, on the other side of the glass, in her backyard. In reality, he had been standing only a few feet behind her in the same room while she had been talking to 911. Nothing was stolen, broken, or out of place, so we don't know what his intentions were. Who knows what would have happened had she not stayed on the line with the operator. I know it sounds like something out of a campfire story, but it was honestly one of the most unnerving and creepy experiences I have had while on duty. My dad spent his whole career as a cop and is the stereotypical straightforward bloke who has little time for anything you might label as paranormal. That said, he describes one event from about 20 years ago that he can't explain. One late afternoon in autumn, he was patrolling with a colleague in Newbury, Berkshire, UK, when they were radioed and asked to check out reports of a fight on the rural outskirts of town. Apparently, sounds of an altercation had been heard coming from a field, of all places, and locals were concerned but hadn't been able to describe or give any more info. When they got to the field in question, my dad and his colleague hopped the fence and headed inwards, not immediately seeing or hearing anything. It was gloomy and a little misty at ground level, but apparently just about enough light was left in the day to see there wasn't obviously anyone about. Apparently, they gave the field a sweep and were on their way back to the car when, as my dad describes it, suddenly all went mental, shouting, screaming, and the sounds of an almighty fight completely surrounded him, even though he was stood in a field completely empty apart from his colleague. He says 3 things in particular that stick with him. Firstly, he wasn't scared shitless at the time, perhaps he would say that, just sort of hugely confused. Secondly, the look on his colleagues' faces that basically said, WTF, you're hearing this too, right? And finally, that after a short time, the sounds just stopped and they made their way back to the car and called in to say nothing was going on. When pushed, he admits it felt like he was in the middle of something significant, and that he thinks he felt and not just heard the fighting around him, and with hindsight, he was more frightened after the event than at the time. He would never describe this as paranormal himself, but to me, this always sounded like a replay-type event people talk about, and subsequently learning about the Civil War history of the specific area in question backs this up, for me at least. I've not heard of other accounts of similar stories from the area, but I haven't looked that hard to be honest. Not me, but my father-in-law. He worked as a deputy for years, and just before he got his job with the state troopers, he got a call to check on an older man, maybe in his 80s, claiming that there was an alien in his closet. Apparently, this man had been calling about this alien for 3 days, but they never sent anyone to check on it because they thought the guy was crazy. This was back in the late 70s or early 80s in rural Florida, so apparently ignoring someone's emergency calls because crazy was something that was okay. So, he gets to the guy's house, and the old man is immediately relieved. He starts going on and on about how he didn't know what he was going to do with the alien and that he had it locked in the closet for the last 3 days. He even asked if my father-in-law should bring in military backup. My father-in-law tells him that he is qualified to handle situations like this, that it's part of the training, and tries to calm the guy down enough to show him what is in the closet because now he is concerned that there might actually be someone there. The old guy opens the closet and shows him what's inside. Apparently, a Jehovah's Witness or some similar missionary had come to the old man's door, and because the missionary was Indian, he freaked out, whacked the guy over the head, and tied him up in the closet. The poor guy was covered in his own waste, totally dehydrated, and barely coherent when he finally got out of the closet. Both the old guy and the missionary ended up being taken to the hospital. The missionary got treatment, and the old guy had to wait for his son to come get him because they didn't want a repeat incident. We got a call about trespassers at an abandoned hospital during the daytime. The on-site security, who kept it secure even though it was shut down, swore they had heard footsteps and talking on the second floor over the past few days. They locked down the entire perimeter and called us out there. There was no way out. We went in with 6 officers and started from the 7th floor, systematically checking every single room down to the bottom floor. There was no power, so we were lucky it was still daylight, and there were a lot of windows. It was an older hospital, so they left old CRT monitors from the 1980s and 90s in there. It was pretty eerie and reminded me a lot of the first scenes from The Walking Dead. We cleared down from floors 7 to 5 with no problem. Once we hit the 4th floor, it started getting weird. This was the hospital's storage area. Instead of the big spacious rooms, it was super cramped with cinder block walls. There were chain-link cages all over the place with old locks on them. It seriously looked like a horror movie prisoner area where they locked victims up. It was also pitch black. The hospital was so big that we worked in 2-man groups on each floor but naturally split up as the floors opened up more. The 3rd floor was a mental ward area, so the padded walls and pitch-dark rooms started to make me a little nervous. The 2nd floor was by far the worst, the surgery ward. There were no windows, it was pitch black, and there were large eerie operating rooms all over. In the middle of some of the rooms were large metal slabs where they would operate on people. In adjoining rooms, they had huge pegboards where they stored the surgical power tools. How did I know it was power tools? They had marked the outlines of various drills, saws, and other painful-looking devices. It was kind of freaky thinking about how many people had died in those rooms when they couldn't be saved. I was definitely nervous clearing those rooms solo in pitch black with only a flashlight. We eventually cleared every single room on every single floor and found nothing. The security guards swore up and down that they always heard talking and footsteps down the halls, though. We pretty much swore off that place and said not to call us anymore. Subscribe if you enjoy the video or watch another.